So in this video, I want to dig a little deeper into this scientific construct known as implicit bias and why it is beset with so many conceptual and definitional problems. Now, if you're unfamiliar with my channel, I try to synthesize disparate knowledge from the past that might not be well known or completely forgotten today and interject that knowledge into today's conversation and expose people to ideas they may have never been exposed to before. So in this video, I'm going to include a little bit of economic history and the importance of a certain school of thought that goes all the way back to the Scottish Enlightenment to highlight an amazing social phenomenon, which, believe it or not, has profound bearing upon this topic of implicit bias. So with that being said, I will see you in 10 seconds. So first off, right off the bat, I need to apologize for the length of delay in time for getting these videos out. I got sick about a month and a half ago, and I just couldn't get rid of the cold. I kept getting sick and then over it and then sick, and then another week would go by and I was sick again. So I'm hoping that I can get more videos out sooner and hopefully stick to like a 2-week time frame. That's the goal anyways. So with that being said, let's jump right in. The first thing I want to bring up, which I mentioned in the last video, is that there is no consensus within the literature on what exactly implicit bias is. This may sound shocking, especially in light of how this concept is presented even still to this day to an unsuspecting public, but it's nonetheless true. And to back up this point, I'm going to put on the screen a handful of journal articles. Now, I'm not going to go through each one of them, but I wanted to include them here because this relatively small sample is reflective of a much greater problem when it comes to the concept of implicit bias, which is that none of these articles on your screen do not define at any point in the article what exactly implicit bias is. Mind you, this is not the USA Today or The Guardian. This is supposed to be the highest caliber of intellectual and scientific rigor on display, and yet you will search in vain for a precise definition of what exactly implicit bias is, which is baffling, since this concept and the test associated with it is being used as the scientific construct throughout corporate America to supposedly identify and rectify hidden racial biases. But like I said in the last video, this problem is actually much worse because when you do finally land upon a definition, that definition contradicts a previous definition. And this is a major problem because how can anyone claim scientific precision when their own definitions contradict each other? So to start with, there appears to be, as far as I can tell, at least 5, maybe up to 8 different definitions or interpretations of what implicit bias is. Some are very clear-cut, and others are kind of a hybrid mishmash of 2 theories combined together, depending, of course, upon which publication you read and take as the definitive answer or definitive source. Now, like I said earlier, I'm not going to go through all of them. Otherwise, this video could easily be a 10-hour video. And trust me, I have that horrible potential within me. So instead, I'm purposely choosing the 2 most common definitions that I've come across within the implicit bias literature. So the first one is what has been termed as the procedural definition of implicit bias. And a procedural definition simply refers to what procedures one should follow, like following the steps of a recipe or a how-to manual when measuring for implicit bias. And here's the thing with procedural definitions. There's nothing necessarily wrong with them within an established science. They are more along the lines of a proper method or methodology concerning measurement practices to guard against error or statistical noise. However, one of the main drawbacks of strictly procedural definitions is that they lack content. They are devoid of content. Procedural definitions are much like the rules of formal logic. If you make a mistake in reasoning, logic will show you where and what you did wrong, but logic in itself has no data or no content. All that logic is doing is measuring the relationships between premises, which is why we say that an argument is either valid or invalid. Logic doesn't tell you the truth value of an argument. For example, one could argue that all moons are made of green cheese, and that since we have a moon in our solar system, therefore our moon is also made of green cheese. Now, my question to you is this a valid argument? Yes, it is a valid argument. The conclusion follows necessarily from the premises by what is called resistless logic. However, is that argument true? Now we are asking a question that logic, formally speaking, cannot do. The composition of the moon is not a question of logic, only the argument is. Logic is only concerned with the relationships of the premises and not necessarily with the truth value of those premises. That's a very important distinction that sometimes gets overlooked. Logic, if you will, and procedural definitions simply alerts us to a formal error or a mistake in our reasoning, or in this case, an error or misstep in our measurements. And because of this, we can say that if this is your chosen definition, then you also cannot infer any kind of causal power or influence from it, because as stated earlier, strictly procedural definitions are devoid of content. So to demonstrate this point of a strictly procedural definition, here's a quote from Dr. Greenwald and Dr. Banaji in the American Psychologist Journal in 2017. Many publications continue to use implicit and explicit with conceptual meaning as unconscious versus conscious, rather than with their better justified empirical indirect versus direct meaning, even though the present authors find themselves occasionally lapsing to use implicit and explicit as if they had conceptual meaning. They strongly endorse the empirical understanding of the implicit-explicit distinction. So let me unpack this statement. What Drs. Banaji and Greenwald are referring to is the fact that other authors, other publications, continue to use the phrases implicit and explicit as if they refer to the older or previous unconscious versus conscious paradigm, rather than with the much better established and newer understanding that views these categories of implicit and explicit as referring to their indirect versus direct empirical meaning. Furthermore, they admit in that second sentence that they themselves occasionally lapse into this conceptual error as if it had, what do they say? As if it had conceptual meaning. That's our first clue that we are dealing with a strictly procedural definition. When something has, to quote, no conceptual meaning, then it is devoid of content. It is, if you will, in this context, agnostic in regards to mental processes. It is a strictly measurable phenomenon. That's the empirical side of it. Now, I know that I'm belaboring this point, but I'm doing this on purpose because this is a pretty big deal, because their original claims and the initial excitement surrounding this concept was that it centered upon the unconscious mind and the hidden racial biases that resided within it. Now, I have to just throw this out here. It is kind of alarming that the two social scientists most responsible for this whole entire scientific paradigm, that they themselves get confused over which terminology to use. I appreciate their candor. I truly do. But this admission does give credence to the criticism that there is far too much ambiguity surrounding these terms to qualify as a legitimate scientific undertaking. But putting that concern aside for now, that's the first definition of implicit bias I give you. Now, if you think this definition is a little bit odd, strange, or even confusing, then I can assure you, you ain't seen nothing yet, because the very next definition completely contradicts the one I just covered. And I say this because just 3 short years later, in another journal article in the Annual Review of Psychology in 2020, Dr. Greenwald and another doctor, Dr. Lai, say this in the abstract. And all the abstract is just a brief synopsis or an opening statement that you'll see at the beginning of most journal articles. They say this: in the last 20 years, research on implicit social cognition has established that social judgments and behavior are guided by attitudes and stereotypes of which the actor may lack awareness. Now, did you catch that? Did not Dr. Anthony Greenwald just state in the previous article from 2017 that referring to implicit bias as relating to unconscious or lack of awareness had what? Had no conceptual meaning. Now, here he is again in 2020 contradicting his own previous statement, which prompts one to ask, which one is it? Which definition are we holding to? Now, for the sake of clarity, I'll put both quotes on the screen to demonstrate this glaring contrast between them. The quote on the top of your screen is from 2017, and the lower quote is from 2020, in which they state once again that in the last 20 years, research on implicit social cognition has established, note that word established, that social judgments and behavior are guided, note that word guided, by attitudes and stereotypes of which the actor may lack awareness. That quote at the bottom of your screen is hearkening back to that which they repudiated in 2017, in which they themselves said that it is an unjustified move to impute or infer unconscious motives to implicit cognition. Now they are contradicting that prior claim and are front-loading mental processes into a procedural definition, which is both unwarranted and an illegitimate inference. Now, I realize that I can't read the author's minds. I grant that, but ladies and gentlemen, I am left with no choice but to assume that this confusion and ambiguity over these concepts is on purpose. It sure appears to me that these social psychologists, to put it lightly, are attempting to have their implicit bias or unconsciously biased cake and eat it too. That phrase, are guided or is guided, in the bottom quote, suggests causal influence at the unconscious level, which was supposedly, in the previous quote, deemed an illegitimate inference that had no empirical basis, which is why the authors strongly endorse the empirical version. Now, this is just one example of numerous, multiple examples within the literature of implicit bias that is all over the map when it comes to what I'm referring to as definitional chaos. I just chose 2 recent articles out of the hundreds of journal articles and books I have read, published within a relatively short time span of each other, to demonstrate a point that this entire field is beset with conceptual confusion and imprecision. I don't think we're involved in science anymore, but in saving face, saving careers, and ultimately saving reputations. Like I said in the previous video, there's a billion-dollar industry attached to this idea. If this construct crumbles to the ground, what are they left with? To use modern-day slang, they are left with a big, fat nothing burger. That's what. Now, for the sake of argument, let's assume that these social psychologists made an honest mistake and attempt to understand, based upon their own revision of their previous revision, their prior assumption or prior definition, which was that implicit bias does refer to unconscious motivations or beliefs that are hidden from our awareness. That is, that these attitudes and prejudices, because they reside in our unconscious mind, means that we are not even aware of possessing them. Let's just take that original definition at face value before all of these succeeding and confusing emendations. Now, this definition, the original definition, assumes that our lack of awareness of the effects of our own biases upon other people, other social groups outside of our own, is what makes implicit bias so maladaptive and socially destructive. I'll say that again. This original position, original definition, is claiming that unawareness of the effects of our own biases on other people is what implicit bias is. That's a pretty clear-cut definition and is the exact same argument that is routinely used by both critical race theorists and activists to argue that systemic or institutional racism occurs because of the ignorance of our own actions or implicitly held beliefs. Please understand, I'm not loading any new information or straw manning their original position. This is what both Dr. Greenwald and Banaji referred to in that first video in this series, both in their book Blind Spot and subsequent articles, lectures, videos, and even numerous courtroom testimonies. I am belaboring this point on purpose because it is extremely important to me to be fair here. So, for the sake of clarity, implicit bias, according to their most recent article, which jives with their original definition from over 20 years ago, is that implicit bias is unawareness of our biases or the unconscious effects of our biases upon other people, which produces in the aggregate negative social outcomes. Now, this is where we get to the really good stuff. There's actually an entire school of thought that goes all the way back to what is known as the School of Salamanca in Spain during the Renaissance, in which this school, the School of Salamanca, discovered this amazing, invisible social phenomena that is produced or arises out of the actions of human beings interacting with other human beings. And this invisible social phenomenon would later be termed by various writers as a spontaneous social order. Now, there are key differences between the implicit racial bias construct and the spontaneous social order school of thought, which causes these two schools of thought or movements to diverge at key critical points, which I'll get back to. But I want to first focus upon this lineage of thought and flesh out this idea of a spontaneous social order, because you'll see this same idea of a spontaneous social order scattered in the various writings of Edmund Burke in the 18th century, and you'll find this same school of thought culminating in the Scottish Enlightenment, which includes such figures as David Hume, Adam Smith, and Adam Ferguson, and you'll find this same lineage of thought in France in the early 19th century within the works of Frederick Bastiat, and later in Belgium in the political and economic writings of Gustave de Molinari, and east into Austria in the late 19th century with the works of Karl Menger, and over into England and across the pond into America with the works of Karl Popper, Michael Oakeshott, and F.A. Hayek of just their previous century, all of whom have shown in their own way that many, if not most, of our actions produces an order that we could never foresee nor even consciously intend. In other words, our choices and actions have far-reaching consequences outside the purview of our own conscious awareness. And to help explain this order, this spontaneous social order, I'm going to use 3 examples to describe this social order that results from human action, but not necessarily from human design. So the first example of a spontaneous order is language. Language is the classic example par excellence of an organic, natural, spontaneous, bottom-up order that arises from the natural interactions between fellow human beings. And yet, at no time in the development of language did this order come from the top down. Language is at all times the product of individual minds interacting with other individual minds, yet no single human mind is behind it. Language, if you will, is an example of an organic order that arises beyond our own original intent. If you just stop and think about it, language is an exceedingly complex social phenomenon, yet no single person or solitary human mind designed or controls language. Not only did language exist prior to our own existence, but language will more than likely continue to exist after our own existence. And yet at the same time, we are also able or gifted with the ability to shape and use this pre-existing language for our own benefit through a voluntary process of trial and error, revision, and feedback as we interact with other people who also contribute in this give and take process, this relationship with us and with each other to influence and shape language together. In other words, language is an example of the effects of an order that we use daily, yet this order arises beyond our own original intent or even individual conscious control of. A really good way to sum up this position would be to say that we are both the co-creators and stewards of language at the same time. Now, what I'm about to say is really important. This same school of thought that I'm referring to also distinguishes between an extended order that arises from natural, spontaneous, harmonious, organic, bottom up processes and an order that arises from unnatural, controlled, calculated, artificial processes that is imposed from the top down. This second type of order would be classified by this long line of thinkers, going back to the Scottish Enlightenment and the School of Salamanca, as a form of what is known as Constructivist Rationalism. And what these various writers showed is that this version of rationalism, this Constructivist Rationalism, is not the proper use of reason, but is instead a profoundly malignant use. It is an abuse of reason. It is using reason beyond its boundaries. And yet, this abuse of reason, according to these thinkers, and for which history has abundantly shown, is also highly attractive and tends to both attract and delude, historically speaking, the intellectual class in society, especially those with a mathematical, engineering, or authoritarian frame of mind, the technocratic mind, for whom this type of reasoning or rationality is most attractive, which believes it can rationally construct a harmonious society from the top down, never realizing that the implementation of this rationally designed plan necessarily crushes and imposes upon the choices, actions, and decisions of free human beings to even be successful, which is the opposite of success. This is who Adam Smith is referring to when he called this particular kind of person who is attracted to this constructivist rationalism as a man of the system. Here's the full quote. "The man of the system, on the contrary, is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He goes on to establish it completely and in all parts, without regard either to the great interest or to the strong prejudices which may oppose it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them, but that in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislator might choose to impress upon it." What Smith is saying here is that the man of the system, the man who tends to cloak himself in the benevolence of humanity, is actually the enemy of humanity, because in order to bring his rationally designed plan into effect, he must by default override the individual actions and choices of free people. Now, this is why I said, I believe 2 videos ago, on why progressivism or leftism is a fundamental rejection of the guiding principles of our society that came out of the American Revolution, which left the individual free for the first time in history, free to make his or her own choices without the interference of an aristocratic class of rulers, of moral busybodies, which is exactly the long, tragic history of mankind. And yet progressivism wants to return us back to that tragic history by interjecting into society another class of rulers, this time called the expert class or managerial class, the administrative state. And I know that this may shock modern sensibilities, especially modern progressive ears, but the emergence of freedom is not the norm. It is the anomaly. The norm of history is one of servility, bondage, and subservience for the common man and woman, always to some form of elitist class of people and never to freedom. And I dare to say this, but the more that this truism is maintained in the forefront of our minds, the greater we can be on guard against men and women of the system. And the more one's cherished progressive ideas or beliefs begin to evaporate once this invisible social reality is grasped. And the good news is, I think there is some evidence that more and more people are beginning to wake up and realize as the Overton window continues to shift that not only can the unelected expert class get it wrong, dangerously wrong, as even a cursory knowledge of the past 2.5 years has abundantly shown, unless one is still locked inside a CNN bubble or the cathedral's echo chamber of like-minded institutions who all push the same narrative, but history has ruthlessly shown that the expert class is not only not immune from the same human fallibilities and frailties that we all suffer from, but also the same vices as the rest of us mere mortals. Yet, until more and more people begin to understand this, we will continue to get men like this. Now, I know that this person is a polarizing figure, but I'm not posting his face here for the sake of adding more heat to the conversation, but hopefully to bring some light to the conversation, especially for those who can't understand or may struggle with why some people cannot stand him. Anthony Fauci, to me, is a classic man of the system. In my opinion, Dr. Fauci is not a hero, but is a man who sees society as a great chessboard upon which he can freely move about the pieces without any regard for the individual choices of those pieces, which are not pieces, but are human beings, each with precious lives of their own. He even cloaks his actions in the beneficence of humanity, or in his case, the greater good. And even when caught in an obvious act of deception, let's just take masking. What did he refer to it as? As a noble lie. And this is because for the man of the system, the ends always justifies the means. The man of the system is full of knowledge. That much is guaranteed, even hyper specialized knowledge, but he lacks the ability, the wisdom to see beyond his own plans. You see, wisdom, true wisdom, consists in knowing the limits of one's own power, the limitations of one's own knowledge. But the technocratic mind does not possess this limitation. He assumes that the world is as simple and easily controllable and can be mastered like the equation staring back at him on his computer screen. His blind trust in formulas not only exposes his lack of wisdom, but belies his moral judgment. This is why the man of the system gets so agitated and frustrated when those chessboard pieces won't comply and just do as they're told. The man of the system, despite his grandiose plans, actually lacks vital information, what the philosopher of science Michael Polanyi called tacit knowledge or tacit information. And tacit knowledge is simply knowledge of a specific time and place and situation that is uniquely captured or embedded in the language, customs, beliefs, habits, or culture of a people, or in the mind of an individual or individuals. And because of this, this type of knowledge is unable to be expressed with any kind of scientific precision, which is the very thing that the social engineer needs most. What this means is that this type of inarticulate, dispersed, fragmentary, inchoate, and individualized knowledge defies scientific capture. It is qualitative, not quantitative. It is data, if you will, that cannot be crunched. The other attribute, according to Polanyi, is that tacit knowledge is constantly changing, and this dynamism is a feature, not a bug, of this type of knowledge, which means that this type of knowledge, due to its dynamic nature, escapes predictability, which is the other thing that the technocratic mind needs for his elaborate system to work as planned. What Polanyi was referring to was localized knowledge, or dare I say, indigenous knowledge, or native knowledge, knowledge on the ground, knowledge on the spot. And because this knowledge is constantly changing and is dynamic, it cannot be controlled from the top down, much less gathered and centralized into a coherent body of information due to its necessarily fragmented nature. Thus, the technocratic mind, the mind of the man of the system, contrary to his best of intentions, because he neither knows nor can he account for this type of tacit knowledge, only succeeds in exalting his own ignorance and his own blind hubris to the problem. Thinking himself to be wise, he becomes the fool. Yet, make no mistake, this uncapturable and unpredictable knowledge is a most bitter pill to swallow for the technocratic mind, for the mind of the man of the system, who has been raised upon a steady diet of quantification and for whom qualitative knowledge is not only invalid, but eludes his grasp. However, in spite of this ignorance, very rarely throughout history does this epistemological constraint stop the man of the system from trying to implement his plans. In the final analysis, what this means is that for the mind of the man of the system, his worldview is wholly inadequate for the job he thinks he is most wholly qualified for. This is the fatal conceit that F.A. Hayek wrote about based off Adam Smith's quote that afflicts the man of the system, who thinks his plan in all of its ways is superior to that of either natural liberty or that of our Creator himself. Now, here's the thing. You can disagree with me over the interpretation of Anthony Fauci. That's fine. But you cannot disagree with me over this. This school of thought views the man of the system as the greatest enemy of mankind because the plans of this type of man, even before one brick is laid or one piece upon the chessboard is moved, his plan relies upon force and coercion in its very inception, in its very genesis, which is the polar opposite of freedom. There within the very seed he plants, tyranny lies dormant prior even to its sprouting. Thus, the beauty of a classically liberal order in which people are left free to their own choices, and if government is to exist at all under this system, must exist as a limited institution with limited power and limited intrusion. Otherwise, this institution necessarily crushes liberty. There is so much more I could bring to the surface from this one particular school of thought. But as I stated earlier, my goal is to expose, even if it's just one person, to an idea their worldview may have never been exposed to, and maybe quite possibly that will be the one idea that gets depth of ingress into someone's mind and causes a reevaluation of their beliefs, leading hopefully and ultimately to a paradigm shift in their thinking, or in the very least, they begin to understand why one side of the aisle sees things so differently from them, and maybe open a path for communication. Now, I wish that this information alone could help mend the dividing line in our culture, but I'm not naive. I realize, and this is my opinion, and you are absolutely free to disagree with me, but at root, how I see it, is that the pandemic was the perfect storm that exposed everyone's underlying belief system, whether you liked it or not, and showed where everyone's true allegiances lie, and went straight to the bone, straight to the core, and showed that we truly do have two separate classes of people in our society: those who value freedom as man's highest political end, and those who value safety as man's highest end. And I don't know how those two opposing ends can be reconciled. And to be honest with you, I don't think they can. And I grant that I may be overstating the case, or maybe I'm directly over the target. But speaking strictly as a Christian, and you can skip over this if you want to, but the solutions that this world needs cannot be found in this world. It was never meant to. Thus, the personal and societal need and radical nature, the otherworldly nature of the gospel. Now, with that being said, if I can offer two trade-offs from within this immanent system, from within the world, and I realize that this is going to sound condescending to one side of the aisle, but there is no neutral ground. There never was. First, that those who value safety over freedom are possibly missing some key vital information which lends itself to a truncated or not fully informed worldview, and is in desperate need of the tragic lessons of history of what happens to man whenever he chooses safety over freedom. It never ends well for him or his progeny that follows after him. And If you don't believe me, I will charitably throw down the gauntlet. Challenge me, show me where in history trading freedom for safety has ever bode well for man or his offspring. Secondly, maybe it is time to seriously consider a peaceful national divorce. I know that that may sound shocking, especially for those whose thinking on this subject, and I say this in a spirit of gentleness, but for those whose thinking on this subject has regrettably never moved past their eighth grade civics class, but when a people no longer share anything in common, the only other option to maintain this legal fiction of unity is force, coercion, or violence, which is exactly what the mind of the man or woman of the system always chooses. Is not peaceful dissolution where I go my own way and you go your own way the far better, more peaceful option? Am I truly an extremist or your enemy for daring to suggest this? And I say this because, according to this man of the system, I am. And to be honest with you, I don't even know what this man is talking about. This may be a news flash for some people, but nowhere does it say in our Constitution, or is it enshrined in our Constitution, that our democracy, actually republic, depends upon our current two-party duopolistic system for its legitimacy. And the fact that so many Americans do not know this conveys to me how easily conditioned or gaslit the American mind has become. Now, I want to shift gears and get back to this phenomenon of an order that arises as a consequence of our actions, but not necessarily our intent. And this order not only applies to language, but to law as well, especially the historical development of common law, but also to the very origin of money itself, which is our next example. You see, money originates always from the bottom up throughout history at all times, as people trade and exchange with each other under a direct or what is called barter economy. There arises out of this type of economy a commodity or good in itself that begins to be recognized as having an additional value besides its original value as a good. This commodity or good then becomes valued as society's most marketable good, because one can now trade this highly marketable good for other goods and services, meaning that this commodity quickly becomes that society's chosen medium of exchange to help facilitate with transactions. And eventually, this medium of exchange turns into what society calls money. And once money is adopted, this takes us out of a direct or a barter economy into an indirect economy, which is basically the birth of our modern day economy. And the beautiful thing is that at no point in time during this natural, organic, spontaneous, bottom up process is there any type of top down control or fiat control over the origin of money. Money is a product of human action, but not necessarily human design. Money originates to help facilitate individual transactions and grows outward into an ever expanding process that the original user or users of money never personally intended. Now, on a quick side note, I cannot help myself here. I am convinced that once someone learns about the actual origin of money, they can never look at government control over a nation's money supply the same way again. Understanding the origin of money will not only dissuade you from government control and central banks like our Federal Reserve and Treasury as parasitic, destructive, and Johnny-come-lately top-down institutions, but will also dissuade you of any progressive, socialist, or, God forbid, Marxist understanding of money. I am 100% convinced that once you begin learning about the origin of money, you'll be either forced to abandon the Democratic Party and the Republican Party and join forces with the truly smart ones, the chosen ones, the libertarians, or you'll just have to live in a state of perpetual cognitive dissonance for the rest of your life. So choose wisely, my friends. So I'll give one more example of this spontaneous order, and then we'll move on. And this will be a somewhat personal example to illustrate this order that arises from the consequences of my own individual action that I neither intend nor know the full consequences thereof. So let's take the price of gasoline, and I'll give you some personal background information. So I own a big red 4x4 pickup truck with a Slayer sticker on the back. Yes, I am a Christian, and yes, I listen to Slayer. I have discernment, and yes, sometimes the lyrics are beyond corny, but I love the drums and guitar riffs. I'm a metalhead and punk rocker at heart. What's the old saying? You can take a kid out of the 80s, but you can't take the 80s out of the kid. That's me. So if you see this truck in the left lane in your rear view mirror, get out of the way. The left lane is for passing, not cruising. Anyways, so whether I abstain from purchasing gasoline for my truck or I do purchase gasoline for my uber manly truck, both my inaction or action contributes, no matter how small, to the supply and demand of gasoline, which in turn contributes, even if slightly or marginally, to the price of gasoline, which is not only an amazing phenomenon in itself, but another beautiful example of a spontaneous, harmonious order that no centrally planned or rationally designed single-minded person or Politburo committee could ever come up with. The free market solves all of this glut of information and coordinates it into the sticker price of gasoline. And I gotta say this, all of us take that sticker price, that price tag on every product we purchase for granted without ever realizing how much information it truly captures and conveys beyond our limited, finite understanding. The price tag is an amazing thing that so very few people understand or are even aware of. And it is a shame that so many people, young people, go to school for most of their young lives and are never exposed to this amazing social phenomenon that takes place right under their noses. And I say this because I have met trained economists who work for the state who know nothing about this social reality, which is not only tragic, but is one of the reasons why modern economics is so irrelevant today. That's why whenever I hear someone criticize the free market, not crony capitalism or corporate welfare, but the free market, I think, oh man, you haven't done the homework. You do not know what you speak of. Either you've adopted some sort of nirvana fallacy or are interpreting the free market through some sort of socialist, progressive, or perfect competition model and haven't actually read a book defending the free market from a free market perspective. Or worse, you're getting your information from an absolutely god-awful Marxist like Richard Wolff, who just doesn't understand basic, fundamental, rudimentary economics. Now, please understand, I'm not saying that the free market is perfect, far from it. Human nature being what it is, and the fact that we live in a world of scarcity means that there is nothing in this world but trade-offs, never perfect solutions. The free market, in my mind, is the best of the worst systems out there and does more often than not harness freedom as a profound force for good and can even, once properly understood, neutralize evil in the service of the good. But that is a whole other video series in itself. So what I have been trying to show is that either our action or inaction has consequences or effects outside of our original intention, conscious awareness, or control, and that there is an interconnectedness to the free market because the free market is at root simply the product of the free choices of free people. And it is precisely this phenomenon of a spontaneous bottom-up order that Adam Smith, coming out of the Scottish Enlightenment, referred to famously as the invisible hand when he said that the individual intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end for which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was not part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. This is a brilliant insight, and one of the implications of this quote is not only the hidden social reality that Smith illuminates, that pursuing our own individual actions produces in the aggregate a greater benefit to society than any kind of rationally constructed top-down plan that eliminates freedom. In addition, an equally important implication of this quote that Smith is describing is that this invisible social reality, this spontaneous order, also helps to explain why the so-called expert class, the intellectual class, the progressive class, and the neoconservative right, the mind of the man of the system, which is the same exact worldview which makes up the cathedral, which pushes constantly this highly curated narrative that derides, if not downright hates, the free choices of free individuals, the choices that the common man makes his traditional way of life, the candidates he chooses, supports, and votes for, and the free market in which he thrives, is because this invisible order that Smith articulated is either something this class of intellectual eggheads is completely ignorant of, which once again not only eludes their grasp, but also discredits their so-called superior moral judgment. Or, quite simply, the intellectual chattering class in our society sees clearly that this social reality has no place for them in it, and that all of their fancy degrees from their fancy schools amount to nothing so long as this natural, organic, bottom-up reality exists. In other words, this spontaneous social order that this school of thought identified centuries ago is in direct competition and always has been with the expert managerial class and their enlightened vision of the world and their role at the top of it. This is why the message from the cathedral is garbage. This social reality that Smith and others clearly described cuts against both the credibility and need for an anointed class of intellectuals, the expert class, and leaves them ultimately with no job security. Thus, the intellectuals need to downplay and criticize not only the workings of the spontaneous free market, but as I said earlier, also the free choices of the common man, the middle class, his traditional way of life, and the political candidates for whom the common man votes for, thereby ensuring the role of the intellectual class either within the revolving door of the cathedral or within the top-down control of the establishment. Now, on a personal note, it is this vibrant and fascinating social reality, this spontaneous order that lies behind or undergirds my thinking and others when we say that the cathedral is gaslighting you. And sadly, most people have no idea the degree to which they are being gaslit by mainstream media, the main purveyors of an artificial, unnatural, highly controlled and curated, manipulated, top-down constructivist order. Now, I know you didn't come here to get a full lesson in economics or political philosophy, but this school of thought has some of the most profound and brilliant insights that I have ever come across, and I urge everyone to please study and familiarize yourself with this school of thought. Now, here's the thing, and this is where these two schools of thought ultimately diverge. There's nothing wrong with a science or discipline that is devoted to studying the effects, the consequences, or the order that arises from the decisions and actions that we have neither intended nor have any conscious control over or awareness of, but turning that innocuous observation into a loaded definition that says that our ignorance of the effects of our biases upon other people now qualifies as implicit racial bias, then we're no longer in Kansas anymore, Toto. Something has changed. Something drastic has changed. What I'm saying is this: saying that our actions produce unintended consequences is fine. That's normal. There's nothing new in that observation. However, saying that our ignorance or unawareness of the effects that we produce is now somehow an example of implicit racial bias is not only an invalid inference, but if this inference is to stand, then it must be proven and not simply adopted or assumed, within the very definition itself. This is a classic example of the fallacy of petitio principii, of begging the question, assuming that which needs to be proven. In other words, there is a hidden premise or assumption that has been snuck into the definition itself. Now, once again, for the sake of clarity, let me try to state this in a different way, because this is important. Arguing that our choices, our actions, and our decisions produces unintended effects or consequences upon the greater society is an established science. It's called economics, and it's also a somewhat common observation. However, stating that ignorance over those same choices, actions, and decisions is now somehow racist or unconsciously racist is not only invalid, but is the importation of the researcher's own subjective value judgment, which immediately takes us out of the realm of objective, measurable science, which is bad enough and should disqualify right here the is-ought fallacy, but also reveals once again the social psychologist's temptation to impute or rely upon only one singular cause or one explanation for that definition to stand. They are illegitimately imputing racism or hidden racial bias into the equation when quite possibly none may exist at all, thereby changing the equation through a sort of academic sleight of hand. This blind leap to impute or infer racism from unconsciously or implicitly held beliefs because we don't know the full consequences thereof of such actions is not only unscientific but unjustified. And here's why this leap in logic is so unjustified and ultimately so immoral, because this position is arguing for something that we as human beings do not possess. This may be another news flash to some people, but none of us know the future or the full ramifications of our choices, decisions, or actions. How can I or you be blamed for lack of omniscience, an attribute that I can assure you that none of us will ever possess? This attribute is, according to Christian theology, an incommunicable and intransitive attribute that only God himself can possess. How is that fair or even your fault to be blamed for something that you yourself will never possess? We all as human beings suffer from this epistemic limitation of finite knowledge. To infer nefarious biases from this limitation is simply unjustified and morally wrong because it presupposes guilt, or in this case, implicit guilt. And it is precisely this uncritical view that prompted two researchers to pose a theoretical question in one of their papers, which asked the question, would Jesse Jackson fail the implicit association test? To which the author said, yes, more than likely, because according to this broad and loosely defined definition of implicit bias, it fails to make any necessary distinctions and therefore subsumes every motive as a hidden motive of prejudice. So here's the takeaway of all of this in a nutshell. If someone is going to hold to this definition of implicit bias, then they need to show every step of the way how they arrived at this conclusion. Otherwise, it is untenable. To be fair, at most, all that the social scientists can say, if they are holding to this original definition, is that our choices, actions, or decisions may possibly produce negative consequences or negative outcomes, but that is all they can say. They can go no further. They cannot impute or infer racial biases at the unconscious level because there is neither empirical proof nor a necessary causal linkage between ignorance of the effects of our actions and inferring implicit racial bias from that ignorance. I think what has happened here is really basic, is that one of the reasons why this original understanding, original definition of implicit bias has been abandoned is because this is an example of a definition that fails to make proper and necessary distinctions. When a definition is too broad and amorphous, it loses explanatory power because it overestimates or overshoots the evidence and attributes causal influences where none may exist. Now, another reason why this older definition is no longer held to, except whenever these social psychologists seem to want to play fast and loose with the definitions in the hope that no one catches on is because the older paradigm of the unconscious versus conscious model has been challenged. And this is another factor that complicates things. And although it's publicly known, it's not known well enough, which is that there now exist two competing models, each with their own assumptions and conceptions when it comes to how the mind processes information. And both of these models have been hotly contested within the social sciences for at least the past 17 years or so. The first model is what is called the dual process model, which places cognition into two categories, or what is sometimes referred to as System 1 and System 2. And this paradigm was and kind of still is the reigning paradigm. So the dual process model, which I'm sure everyone has heard of, views the mind as comprising two systems, with one side, the lower side, containing the properties or processes of intuition, automaticity, rapid, unconscious, implicit, high capacity system, and the other system as a higher level processing system, or System 2, containing the properties or processes of rational, non-automaticity, deliberate, conscious, explicit, and a lower capacity system. However, many social psychologists and neurologists now disagree with this view and argue that this is an oversimplified and misleading generic conception of cognition, and is being challenged by what is now called the single process model. And this newer model doesn't deny that we can distinguish between these processes, but only that these differences are a matter of degree, but not of kind. In other words, these elegant categories of the dual process model are not so neat and tidy after all, but bleed into each other because there is evidence that these processes can be activated simultaneously, which, if true, means that these distinctions are not only arbitrary, but simply pragmatic choices, pragmatic categories that we've mistaken for a reality that either operates differently from our conceptions or doesn't actually exist. And not only have we gotten carried away with these categories, but upon closer inspection, they appear to have no empirical weight behind them. Thus, the need, even here, for strictly following procedural definitions. This shift to the empirical, to the single process model, which also has its issues, is to avoid now and in the future precisely this very type of conceptual confusion. And this shift is due even more so now to the replication crisis that I mentioned in the previous video, which is raging through the sciences and exposing the lack of empirically backed science. And I'll restate what I said earlier. If you adopt this procedural approach, then it is illegitimate to infer causal influences or unconscious motives, because procedural definitions are only recipes, steps, guidelines, or procedures for empirical measurement, which once again are devoid of content. Now, all of this stuff that I just mentioned is one of the reasons why dealing with this literature is so frustrating, because hopefully, as you are beginning to see, there is no consensus on this subject, which, as I stated earlier, is all the more baffling because how it has been presented to the public for over 20 years now as some sort of airtight, logically precise, empirically based scientific construct. I may offend some people by saying this, but I'm a human being with moral agency. I have the right to speak my mind. But when I see the way in which this scientific construct called implicit bias has been portrayed both by the media and members of the scientific establishment, and yet the science doesn't match the claims, I'm sorry if you don't agree with me, but I view this as extremely suspect, if not downright deceitful. I see this, in my opinion, as certain social scientists as taking advantage of the public's ignorance and trust and pushing snake oil masquerading as science. I'll end with this. I want to live in an egalitarian world where everyone is treated equally and afforded the same opportunities, a world that grows in racial harmony, a world that is colorblind, a world where people are no longer judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But this entire approach, this implicit bias approach, not only seeks to undermine that delicate and fragile world that I believe in, but does so using ambiguous language, confusing concepts, and a flawed test, which I haven't even got to yet, to achieve its goals. At the end of the day, I have zero sympathy for watching this construct crash and burn to the ground. Lies and deception, if that is what this is, get exactly what they deserve. Thank you everyone for watching. I'll see you in the next video when we continue our critique of this non-scientific construct called implicit bias.